Good afternoon. I'm Ron Weich, the Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law. I am very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, which will examine the impact of climate change on communities around the world, causing people to flee their homes when they can no longer survive or make a living as a result of chronic flooding, drought, or other environmental conditions. What can the legal community do to mitigate the damage and make it easier for people beleaguered by climate change to relocate? Over the next hour, our three panelists, all professors at University of Baltimore School of Law, will share their thoughts on these questions and more. I will serve as moderator for this discussion, but we are looking forward to your participation. You can submit questions using the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard, and we will get to as many of them as we can. So let me introduce this afternoon's panel, three of my fabulous colleagues. Professor Nienke Grossman is co-director of the Center for International and Comparative Law here at UB. She teaches international law, human rights law, and international environmental law, and she's an expert on international human rights, international courts, and tribunals. She has been on our faculty since 2009. Professor Elizabeth Keyes is director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic, is an expert on immigration and naturalization law. She has published several articles on climate migration, including Environmental Refugees, Rethinking What's in a Name, in the North Carolina Journal of International Law. And just this month, she published We Broke It, We Own It, How to Meet the Climate Migration Future in The Alchemist magazine. Liz has been on our faculty since 2012. And finally, Professor Sonia Jaiha teaches environmental law and is an expert on climate change, water policy, and energy regulations. She's been on our faculty since 2020, one of our recent excellent hires, and previously worked in the Public Advocate's Office at the California Public Utilities Commission. So thank you, panelists, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, guests, for joining us as well. And let's begin our discussion. I want to set the stage by turning to Sonia Jaiha. Professor Jaiha, tell us where we are with climate change. We've all been reading the headlines, most recently from Glasgow, Scotland, but really over many years now, about deadlines that the Earth has to avoid the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. How bad is it really? Is it too late to reverse the damage of climate change?
Thanks, Ron. It's a pleasure to be here. To give people some context, that kind of question is a very, very normal question to ask, and is asked of environmental law folks frequently. The problem with it is that it sets up a metaphor that's not quite right. And the metaphor is that we are going off a cliff, and people want to know, are we off the cliff or are we still on it? Where are we in the process of the fall? It's better to think about this in terms of humanity's home. So if you think about all of human history, say humanity is just one big family with multiple generations. We've all lived in the same home for our entire existence. And for most of that existence, like the giant amount of that existence, we've had a really stable home with, like maybe like a leaky roof then, but like you can patch it, it's not a big deal, it comes back. That's called in climate science a historical envelope. And that is the era known as the Holocene. So that's when we've had a stable climate for agriculture, for building cities, we basically know what resources we have, and it's pretty normal. Since the 20th century, our home has had a whole lot of problems. So, we have rooms in our home now which are overheating, and if you go into them, you're going to pass out. There's parts of our home which no longer get, functioning water deliveries to them. And so people are kind of moving around in the home trying to figure out where to go because it doesn't actually work anymore the way that we had anticipated that it would always work. And at this point, there are some things that we can do to repair it. To say that, well, we need to abandon this project completely because it's too late, there's too much wrong with our home, is, a really quick way to annihilation. And that kind of thinking tends to speed up the process of the degradation of the home rather than actually trying to fix it or fix the underlying problem of it. Okay, so moving away from metaphor to something that's a little bit more real. Climate science and talking about climate change is full of numbers, which are really abstract. It's hard for people to understand and grasp. So I like to talk about climate impacts as it relates to my niece. So her name is Sadie. She's 12 years old. Sadie, about 2 years ago, turned 10. When she turned 10, humanity had 60% less available fresh water than we did 50 years ago.
Repeat that statistic. What percent?
60% less available fresh water
Yikes.
than we did 50 years ago. So we're already not in good shape. You know, for the past 2 years, we've had tremendous wildfires in California and all over the Western coast and in the Intermountain West as well. And that's reached us over here. You know, this past summer, you could see a couple of hazy days, which was actually, you can see in satellite imagery, these were wildfire smoke coming from Western wildfires that were driven by climate change.
Do scientists doubt the connection between climate change and these catastrophic weather events?
No, not at all. So the attribution of climate change to specific weather events is really difficult. But what we know, the metaphor that scientists tend to use is that it's like loaded dice. So when we know how the climate is going to affect certain types of natural disasters, and we can see that in terms of the frequency that those natural disasters are happening. So the dice keeps landing a certain way. So we know that that's climate driven. So to give you just a little bit more of an overview, and I'll promise to run through it quickly because
We're good. Keep going.
Hughes and Grossman have a lot to say on this. Okay, so Sadie, my 12-year-old niece, right? So by the time she is 31, so in 2040, 20% of small island nations across the world will have, I'm sorry, of all small island nations, 20% of their landmass will be gone. By the time she's 41, about 1 billion people will have been displaced because of climate change. By the time she's 56, about 1 in 12 people from just the south of the United States, which is, not too bad in terms of climate change compared to other areas of the world, will have moved to another part of the United States to escape climate disasters. By the time she's 88, Buffalo, New York will feel a lot like Tempe, Arizona does now.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's roughly how bad things are and the direction that they're going in.
So this is in our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our children, the next generation. Mm-hmm. This is not the distant future. This is upon us now.
Exactly.
So let's now focus in on the specific topic of this webinar, which is migration as a result of these climate disasters. And I want to turn to Liz Keys. Some people talk about migration as an adaptation strategy. I mean, we build seawalls as one way to keep the water back, but this is actually a way that people are reacting to the current threat. I've heard that in Guatemala, for example, the declining rainfalls mean that people can't grow crops. They can't grow the basic subsistence of life or earn a living by selling crops. And so we see the kind of migration to the US southern border. Professor Keys, tell us who these groups are. Where are we going to see this migration from? What kind of people are most directly affected by this?
Sure. It's thank you for the question, and thank you, Professor Jaya, for setting this up so perfectly. And I would like to stick close to home for a moment because I think this is an issue where we can see such clear parallels between climate migration within the United States and then the topic of this webinar, climate migration that crosses borders. And if you think about in the United States, who is affected by hurricanes the most, whether that's Hurricane Katrina, which affected poor Black residents of New Orleans, sort of disproportionately affected everybody in the city, but lasting harm, lasting damage was disproportionately borne by people who were already in many ways on the margins. Hurricane Maria from Puerto Rico, the same. Some of the mobile homes in California have been disproportionately affected by wildfires. A strategy people have when disaster strikes, and all of those are connected to the increasing rate of climate change. A strategy is to go someplace where they're not facing that risk, or at least to find a new place temporarily. And we see the same thing replicating across the world. So whether it's the decrease in arable land in Central America or West Africa because of desertification, whether it's flooding in Bangladesh or increased flooding in Southeast Asia, people are moving because they cannot sustain their livelihoods. And typically, the people moving are the most marginal in those countries. And the first place people tend to move is elsewhere within the country for reasons I think we can all understand: language barriers, identity, the immigration system, which I know we will talk about. But at a certain point, there are resource scarcity problems that drive them across borders. Um, and as you alluded to, Central American migrants have been a huge source of interest and concern in the United States. And while many, many, many of those migrants are not directly climate change connected, increasingly we see people who are driven from their homes over land disputes. And the reason there are land disputes is land scarcity. And the reason there's land scarcity is climate change. When we turn to sort of legal options, we'll see how that sort of indirectness of climate change becomes a little bit of an issue in terms of their ability to access protection. But the people who are most marginal, least protected, least able to secure sort of police support in their countries to preserve their land rights, for example, are the ones who are forced off their land.
So, I
And
mean,
some of them come to the border.
what I'm hearing from what you're saying is, when we hear about economic migration, people, coming from Central America to the United States for economic opportunities, it's not just that they want more money, it's that they cannot survive given the conditions in those
They
countries.
cannot survive. And so the clinic at the University of Baltimore represents a family, a wonderful family, who, minimal sort of levels of education, but they had sustained their livelihoods over generations, working a small family farm, very small plot, in Honduras. And because of land scarcity, that became of interest to more politically powerful people in their small town. And the more politically powerful people took the land over violently, and they had to flee. There was no place else for them to go.
That's the reality. And you're seeing it in your caseload at
Yes.
the immigration clinic.
Yes.
I want to turn to Professor Nienke Grossman, an international law expert, to ask, what does international law have to say about all of this? What do treaties and other international agreements relating to climate change say to governments about their obligation to address this phenomenon?
Thanks so much for that question, Ron. So there are various different areas within international law that may have a role to play here. And I'm going to stick, for the purposes of this question, to the international law relevant to climate change. And then Professor Keyes will later talk about how international refugee law, what it has to say about this. So there are a number of different international agreements that address climate change, including the 1994 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, the 2015 Paris Agreement, and now most recently from this very week, the 2021 Glasgow Agreement. So the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Kyoto Protocol say nothing at all about individuals displaced due to climate change, which is not all that surprising because they're from 1994 and 1997, and people weren't, quite onto that topic yet at that point in time. The 2015 Paris Agreement preamble says that states should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights in relation to various groups, including migrants. But that's literally all it says about migrants. And the Glasgow Agreement, which comes out of this 26th meeting of the states parties to the UN Framework Convention, contains the same language as the Paris Agreement on this issue.
May I interrupt to just ask one
Sure.
nerdy, lawyerly question? Paris and Glasgow, these aren't treaties, are they? Because they weren't submitted to the Senate for ratification.
So there are different ways to make treaties under US law. You can have treaties that go through the Senate and get the advice and consent of the Senate. You can also have what are called congressional executive agreements that are 50% plus of the House and Senate agree. And you can also have executive agreements. The UN Framework Convention is the Senate ratification type of treaty. The Kyoto Protocol, the US is not a party to, and the Paris Agreement and Glasgow, they're coming out of the conferences of the parties of the UN Framework Convention on climate change. So I just want to add that in 2015, states parties to the Framework Convention did establish a task force on displacement to develop and begin implementing recommendations for approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to adverse impacts of climate change. But that task force is not a lawmaking body and does not speak to obligations of states to individuals displaced by climate change. So instead, it's really focusing on making general recommendations for raising knowledge and awareness about climate-driven displacement. So in sum, the climate change law does not really say much about states' obligations with respect to individuals displaced by climate change. And we'll speak more later about sort of what role human rights might have to play to fill in the blanks.
I want to come back to that, but I feel like you've taken us right back to Liz Keyes to see what other sources of law might address this problem. So now I'm thinking about asylum law. If someone shows up on a border and they have a credible claim of political persecution, they can apply for asylum in the United States. Does that same kind of framework apply to people showing up at the border fleeing climate change?
It applies to a vanishingly small percentage of people showing up and claiming asylum. So the Refugee Convention and asylum law, which is how we implement that domestically, is sort of where people think first about climate migration, because for people who don't study it sort of minutely, there's a sense, well, that's what we do for people who need protection, people who are forced to migrate. So that seems like the fit. But when you look at the actual requirements of the law, by design, it's quite narrow. Because it's a binding obligation on states like countries like the United States that signed on to it. And to meet the requirements of the Refugee Convention, you have to show persecution, which really implies there is a bad actor, and that the persecution, the severe harm, which goes far beyond sort of economic discrimination or inability to make a livelihood, serious though those are, that harm has to be on account of one of only 5 protected reasons: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and something a little bit squishy called membership in a particular social group. So people fleeing environmental degradation, even catastrophic environmental degradation because of climate change, need to show the reason they are affected as opposed to somebody else is because somebody wanted to do something bad to them. So the most direct example that would fit is a climate change activist who faces political pushback and harm.
Because then it fits in that political belief category. You put it into the box within asylum law.
So somebody like Berta Caceres in Honduras, an activist who was murdered, people taking steps like her might receive protection. But people like my clients I mentioned earlier, whose climate change rationale is so much below the surface, we need to show the reason they're being harmed is because of one of these protected reasons. And we're developing that. It'll probably be particular social group, but you will not see climate change as one of the articulated reasons we put forward because it's simply not relevant to the Refugee Convention for most people.
Is there any talk among immigration lawyers, at least, about trying to amend US law to broaden the categories of asylum to cover this class of people?
Broaden asylum, no. Back to international law, the countries in the Western Hemisphere, apart from the United States, do recognize environmental harm as coming under refugee-like protection, not the United States. Things that we're talking about in the United States, but I say talking about, we're in the baby steps of talking about, include expanding protective status for countries where it would be harmful to send people back. We have that already. It's called temporary protected status. A number of countries have benefited from that over the years. It's retrospective. It's for people who are currently here after a bad thing happens.
Well, ironically, I'm remembering that recently Haitians came to the border and did not benefit from protected status,
Correct.
despite the enormous disasters that have befallen that country.
Haiti is a classic example of people who really have been driven for environmental and increasingly climate reasons, but their nominal reason for leaving Haiti is there's no work. And so they don't fit nicely under the Refugee Convention. We need new mechanisms, and we just don't have them.
Well, I want to talk about some other mechanisms. I want to go back to Professor Grossman and then to Professor Jaya. Ninke, human rights law, does that provide an avenue for relief here? Is there something in that bucket that would give some right to people to resettle when they can no longer live in their homelands?
Thanks for the question. It certainly would not. Well, it's not clear that it's not obvious at all that it would give people a right to resettle in somewhere that's not their homeland. It's certainly, human rights law certainly imposes obligations on states in relation to climate migrants, and sort of the scope of that is, I would say, to some extent being worked out. Climate change threatens a wide variety of human rights, and this has already been said by many different UN human rights bodies as well as regional bodies. So, for example, the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights has stated that climate change threatens the rights to life, water, food, health, housing, self-determination, culture, and development. And states have obligations under human rights law to respect, ensure, and protect human rights under international law. There's actually been some really interesting developments lately involving human rights and climate change. And the one that's most relevant to this issue of migration and climate change comes from one of the UN human rights treaty bodies. So there are these bodies of independent experts within the United Nations that interpret and apply specific global treaties involving human rights. And the Human Rights Committee interprets and applies the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And there was a petition filed in that body by an individual from the small island developing state of Kiribati who fled to New Zealand and wanted to stay there. And he argued that New Zealand violated his right to life under the convention by deporting him back. The committee ultimately found that the petition was not admissible for other reasons, but it stated in its decision that the petitioner faced a real risk of impairment to his right to life under the convention due to the impact of climate change and associated sea level rise on the habitability of Kiribati and the security situation on those islands. So this is an area that's being used to by creative lawyers and NGOs to make arguments about what states' obligations are.
Yeah, I mean, we at the outset of this webinar, we said, what can lawyers do? And you just gave us a good example of lawyers using their lawyerly training to shape arguments and present arguments to the appropriate forum to make change.
Yeah, and there's one other really interesting petition I thought might be worth sharing with you in the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So this is the UN body that interprets the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And there were several kids from different countries that filed a petition in the Committee on the Rights of the Child, alleging that their rights were being violated by their states, their countries. States is how you say countries in international law parlance. And they were arguing that their rights to life, food, housing, health, water, and cultural rights under the convention were all being affected by their state's failure to take measures to adapt to and mitigate climate change. So in that petition, the Committee on the Rights of the Child ended up, again, finding that the petition was inadmissible, but also stating that failure to take measures to prevent foreseeable human rights harm caused by climate change or to regulate activities that contribute to that harm could constitute a violation of states' human rights obligations. And one of the really interesting things about that opinion is it talks about the experiences of the individual petitioners and how they were harmed by, fires and smoke and, all kinds of things that affected their rights under the convention.
Well, it's good. It seems like there's a glimmer of hope there for some relief. And before I turn to Sonia Jaha to talk about federal environmental law, I just want to encourage the audience to ask any questions that you may have in the Q&A function. I think we had a little exchange in the chat function, which is okay too. Professor Keyes was able to answer a question there, but I'd be glad to field questions or pose questions to our panelists if audience members have them, and you put them in the Q&A function. But Sonia, what about federal environmental law? Another body of law that we might turn to look for some answers to this global crisis. Do you see anything there that's promising?
Sure. So if you're talking about climate migration in particular, there's nothing really in federal environmental law that's going to help you, because federal environmental law is focused much more on place and impacts to people, and it's much less concerned with who those people are. The exception there is when you start talking about environmental justice, which is to an extent very focused on who people are, but that's largely, again, tied to place and having a pre-existing toxic burden somewhere. So federal environmental law for migration and climate migration, or federal environmental law just that's not its area, it turns out. And it's much more focused on immigration law would have something to say, other things would be parts of federal law, but perhaps have something to say on this, but environmental law is really silent on it. Where federal environmental law can help alleviate the sort of causes of climate migration, there's some promising things. And so one is the infrastructure bill that was recently passed. Within that infrastructure bill, there is money for grants for changing our forms of transportation to be more bicycle friendly and EV friendly, to include charging stations, to upgrade the national energy grid, so that can more easily include renewable energy generation. One of the big problems, it turns out, with trying to include more renewable energy is that we actually need a more robust transmission system. And so without getting into the details of what an energy transmission system is, I'll just say that it's something that the infrastructure bill did address. It likewise addressed wildfire risk. So I think there's about $3 billion just for wildfire risk reduction in the United States and firefighting, and $2 billion for ecosystem restoration. So this is, again, though, all United States focused. That said, building on what Professor Grossman had mentioned about COP26, when these conference of the parties happen, it's not just that conference that happens, there's also side agreements. And so some of those are subnational. So California had an agreement with a number of subnational jurisdictions to limit emissions yet further. US and China entered into a bilateral agreement to decrease methane emissions. Methane emissions are really important at this stage in climate change because they're very, very powerful greenhouse gases. And so if you can limit those, you actually buy yourself a little bit of time to reduce overall carbon dioxide from fossil fuels.
So we have a couple of very interesting questions now from our audience. So let's put those before the panelists. Our colleague, Professor Walter Schwedetsky, asks this question. He states, too generous attitudes on refugees can backfire. Ask Germany and what happened when it opened its borders to Syrian refugees. It was overwhelmed by 1.5 million immigrants, very many of whom were not Syrians. US politics clearly does not favor large-scale economic immigration. What can we do to help people in their own countries? I pose that to any of the panelists, and Liz Keys has a hand up. Walter seems to be saying, okay, so Guatemala's got a crisis here. How can we help people in Guatemala before they come to the southern border of the US?
So thank you, Professor Schwedetsky, for the question. And there's a few different elements to the answer, which I'll try to go through fairly quickly. First, it's actually not clear-cut, the German situation. At the time, there was sort of a heroism to the Chancellor Merkel's welcome of the refugees, and it quickly turned sour. But 5 years later, there are many, many stories of successful integration, and the politics actually are not clear-cut. It gave rise to right-wing extremism, absolutely, but right-wing extremism exists independent of the immigration issue. So I'm not sure it's as simple a lesson to be learned. That said, yes, the politics of this are very difficult. In the United States, it's a country where the dreamers, arguably of the most sympathetic of all migrants, have not been able to make have not received a political answer to their immigration status 21 years after the first bill was introduced. So I'm not naive about that point. However, this is a problem that is not going away. And there's a wonderful quote by, I believe, a fellow German, Zygmunt Bauman, who talks about we can sit our chairs on the sand and look at the sea and wish the waves would go away, but that will not work. So on the one hand, we need to have answers. Part of the answer may well be adaptation strategies in those countries, which I'm happy to talk more about. I'm putting a link in the chat. This is a link to the US EPA, but it just gives a sense of what different adaptation strategies might look like, and it's not unique to the United States. And so much more can and must be done to help people stay where they are to the extent that's possible in a country, countries that are facing diminishing quality of land as opposed to diminishing existence of land, like the small island nations. I'm talking too much, but there's a lot of ground in one question. People tend to prefer to stay home and not migrate. So to the extent adaptation strategies support that, I think everybody's in agreement, and hopefully we can talk about what came out of Glasgow vis-a-vis funding for those initiatives. But there are nations where migration will have to be an adaptation strategy, and I believe we have a duty. We have, as one of the contributors to climate change, and the developing countries are not the contributors, we have a moral obligation. And so I don't want to say politics be, I'll filter myself, politics be ignored. But we need to think beyond politics about duty and, as President Biden put it last week in Glasgow, moral imperative.
Now, Nikki, I think you're ready to talk.
Yes,
Sorry.
well, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, I think it's a really important question, right? We need to figure out what we can do to help people be able to stay in their own countries. And I think this presents a lot of this is a question of foreign policy and priorities for the United States. So the US has to make decisions about how it wants to proceed here. And I think there are lots of ways that the US can proceed. So there are things like using its foreign aid and expertise to build resilience in Central America, for example, to help make developing states more resilient to climate change, to help adapt to climate change. And also, we have a responsibility to mitigate it, right? So we're causing the problem. We're the biggest historical emitter of greenhouse gases. I think I'm right on that. Sonia, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think China is now taking over, but at least for a long time, we were the biggest emitter, and I think we're the biggest historical one. So we also can play more of a lead in efforts to slow and stop and hopefully, reverse, if that's possible, climate change. And it's been really interesting to see how President Biden has taken on this challenge. In spring 2020, he wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine that climate change is a challenge that, quote, will define our time. And if we don't get this right, nothing else will matter, right? And so I think Professor Schwadetsky's question is tied into all of that. This phenomenon is raising all kinds of problems, and it's driving migration. So we have lots of things that we can do in terms of foreign aid and expertise and leadership at the international level to try to change some of these outcomes.
You're right that this is at the heart of American foreign policy today, and we saw the United States put a great deal of its foreign policy muscle and energy into the Glasgow conference. So let me turn to Sonia. I'm sure you were following events in Glasgow closely, and again, taking the lens back from migration and looking at the overall problem of climate change. Were you satisfied with what came out of Glasgow? Were you disappointed? How did we do there?
Okay, so to let everyone know what my baseline is, I tend to be a little bit pessimistic. So I was really happy about
every reason to be
of Glasgow. But it did fall short on a couple things. And one of the things that it really fell short on is, actually it relates back to Walter's question as well. And the phrase that's used in the agreement and by negotiators is called loss and damage. And loss and damage refers to this kind of obligation of developed countries to pay into a fund to help developing countries deal with the damage that has already been done and will occur from climate change. So that's directly addressing, what do we do to make other countries more stable and habitable? And previously, I think Professor Grossman can correct me, I think it was in the Copenhagen Agreement, but not the Paris Agreement, world leaders had pledged like $100 billion per year to go to developing countries. And we absolutely failed on that. No one really, ponied up cash. So now we have more responsibility, and the agreement actually has more for loss and damage in it. I think they're finally assigning a staff person to the organization that's supposed to facilitate those funds, whereas before there was no staff person in place. So that's some progress. But based on, historical practice, I'm a little bit skeptical if those obligations will actually be fulfilled. On the positive side, for the first time in an international climate agreement, the words fossil fuels appeared. Like that hadn't actually happened yet. And now in this one, we have this language, which I didn't expect to actually be included in the final, but was, which is that the world agrees to a phase down of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, even
am I right? It was supposed to be phase out, and then India came in at the last minute and said phase down. Is that a significant difference?
Yeah. So hopefully it's not too significant. It really depends on how countries respond. It doesn't necessarily have to be a significant difference. What was driving that change, though, was China and India, who are both very, very coal-dependent countries. And because of who is fighting for that change, I suspect it probably is a significant difference.
Let me ask all three of you. One thing we saw in Glasgow was a very dynamic youth movement. Greta Thunberg, famously, is a leader of that, but I think it has many different branches at this point, and they were visible on the streets of Glasgow and in the media. Is that making a difference? I'd ask really, maybe start with Sonia because you were watching Glasgow so closely, but I'll ask all three of you, do you see the next generation kind of taking this problem to a new level and bringing an immediacy to the advocacy that may make a difference? Sonia?
Thank you. So I think you said it right, that the youth movement at these global conventions or even the school strikes have a sort of moral weight to them that makes the problem feel more immediate. And it's more immediate to those people because that's the world that they're going to be living in. My own hesitation here is that the more we focus on the youth, the more likely we are to look to them as leaders and ignore our own responsibilities and our own existing power, especially as attorneys. So that's my one caveat there. But people like Vanessa Makate from Uganda and other activists from the Pacific Islands, I think had incredibly moving speeches to world leaders. They're obviously very brave and charismatic people who are bringing more attention to climate change.
So either Professor Grossman, Professor Keyes, a thought about the next generation? Do you see it in the students that you teach every day? Are you seeing an awareness of this issue?
Yes, I see it. Honestly, I see it most of all in my home with my teenager, who sees this as an existential issue. And I think the youth movement, and it really is broad across the globe. Greta Thunberg became the face, but she is not the only face of this movement. And thanks to the urgency, the undeniable urgency of the way they frame the issue, the subjects that were discussed seriously in Glasgow by the policymakers really shifted, even between 2021 and the last conference in 2019, and certainly from a few years prior. Professor Jaya mentioned the fossil fuels, but the significance, the centrality of adaptation frameworks and the need for funding of those, that has never been more than a sidebar before. And I believe it's thanks to the youth activists that the conversation has become much more meaningful, if not getting us all the way to where we need to be.
Yeah. Nikkei, if not, I actually have a related question that I could pose, and I'll pose it to you first. Our colleague Chris Hart asks a similar question about sort of what are the forces that may be brought to bear on this problem to move the needle. And Chris Hart asks, do you think that the difficulties that excellent forward-thinking lawyers are having on this resettlement immigration issue is one of scale? If lawmakers could understand what it means to have 2 million people uprooted in a matter of days or weeks due to a climate disaster, would they not get it together and start crafting better law? If inability or refusal to envision the scale is not where the bottleneck is, what do you think is preventing real progress? Nikki, do you have a thought about that?
So I think that probably you, Dean Weiss, would have a lot of thoughts on this, given your history in working on the Hill.
I worked in a real disaster area. It was the United States Senate.
There are so many huge, intractable problems and easy to fix problems that we have not yet fixed.
Right.
So I don't think it's, there are aspects of the climate change problem that are unique. It is of an enormous scale, right? It affects every industry. And, we're not just talking about migration, right? If you think beyond just the issue of migration. Climate change has the potential to and is affecting everything, right? So I think one of the challenges here is sometimes people seem to feel a little paralyzed by the scope of the problem. So sometimes you get the sense that people just say, well, it's so huge and so complex that we can't really fix it, so why try? So I do think that is part of it. I want to go back to what Dean Weiss asked before about our students and if they're aware of this and if they think about it. And I actually taught a class on Monday about international environmental law in my international law course. And part of it was devoted to climate change. And one of the questions one of the students asked was, in other countries, are people just assuming that climate change is happening? And that question made me think a little bit about what our students might be thinking about climate change and whether they think that it's actually happening or not. So the way that we approach this problem in the US and what we consider to be controversial is not the case in other countries, in most countries in the world. And I don't think that a lot of people in the US really necessarily get that, because we live in our bubble here and we hear, different voices than people outside the US do. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Yeah, I think, I think you see it across issues. This skepticism of science, this skepticism of federal authority to address problems. It really kind of impairs progress, impedes progress in so many issues, and this is one of them. Let's see. Here's a good question, and maybe it's addressed to me, and I don't know the answer. Is the University of Baltimore's endowment divested from fossil fuels? It's a very good question. I don't know the answer. I don't know that our university would have authority to establish that kind of policy separate from the university system of Maryland. We're a part of a public university system, but I intend to look into that. I don't know if anybody on the panel has a thought about it. I guess Sonia Jaha said little evidence that for fossil fuels, divestment works. Why is that?
Sure. So it's because of how investment markets work. So even if you were a large institutional investor, which, the University of Maryland system, great as it is not, it's the biggest one, you're decreasing the share price and other people will take advantage of that. So even though it's not necessarily a bad thing to do, there's kind of a problem of like climate energy, not in terms of, electrons, but just people's own ability to focus on a problem and develop solutions. So I want to stress how very, very important this is to keep global temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius, like a rise of that, which is still devastating for humanity, by the way. But even to do that, we need, in basically about the next 98 months, to cut global emissions in half. Or the other way to cut the cake is to decrease our emissions 15% globally every year until we get to zero. That is a huge undertaking. That is not something that me, you, and everyone who's listening to this panel, switching our cars by itself, is going to do.
I recycle, but that's not going to do it.
No, so actually, I don't want to take too much time on this, but the strategies for climate denialism have actually shifted over the past decade. So whereas before, and Professor Grossman brought this up with her class, like, do people actually believe in climate change or not? Largely people do, but now there are different strategies in order to get people to just continue the way that things have been. And one of those is actually to focus on individual behavior rather than large systemic behavior. So one of the first carbon calculators that we actually had, so this is a way to figure out how much carbon you and your life is emitting, was developed by British Petroleum. So it's actually a fossil fuel company that was saying here, look at how much you are emitting because we want to draw attention away from ourselves. So that kind of divestment, while not necessarily bad, is taking away energy from things that really need to happen very quickly.
Wow. Let me turn to Nienke Grossman, because a question in the chat is, how did we do in this most recent agreement between the US and China? President Biden had a kind of virtual summit meeting with the Chinese leader, and I guess some diplomatic language emerged from that about cooperation on climate issues. Do you see that as potentially useful, or is this all just words?
So I think what matters is what happens after they sign, after they agree, after they make a statement, you know. And one of the challenges with international environmental law problems as a whole is, how do you monitor compliance with the agreements? How do you enforce the agreements? And there are other areas within international environmental law where there have been better monitoring and enforcement mechanisms established. So that's one of the issues that, you know, still needs to really be worked on and worked out, because it's great for all these countries to make commitments, but the issue is whether they're actually sticking to them and how we can measure that. So there's been some discussion about using satellite technology or other kinds of technology to try to measure compliance. But even if you determine that a state is not complying, you know, what are you going to do about it, right? So it's one thing to say nice things, and it's another thing to verify and monitor and react to failures to comply.
Yes. Liz Keys, immigration law. It didn't sound like there was much hope for expanding asylum, but are there other ways that immigration law could be modified to address this problem without opening the floodgates? I mean, everyone knows that we're simply not going to let the entire population of Central America migrate to the US.
Sure.
Are there ways to somehow take measured steps that would be helpful?
Sure. And just to start by saying, the entire population of Central America does not wish to migrate to the United
No,
States.
I'm sure not.
It's so important to remember that even when we ease up on restrictions, mostly people want to stay. And the best illustration of that, and I'll stay domestically for a second, is there are very poor states. There are very poor cities in the United States, but we don't see mass exodus. And it's because
That's a great
place
point.
matters, community matters, and that's true across the board. However, for people who do feel the need to come, some of the ideas that are, potential sort of models. We have a green card lottery that goes to certain countries. It's 55,000 people a year. It's a modest number. It's not made waves. Um, there could be something like that that was for countries where we have specific historic ties and maybe specific historic responsibilities, programs that we could scale up a little along existing models. There's a tiny program that recognizes this idea of duty in our immigration system for the residents of the Federated States of Micronesia, um, where we did nuclear testing and degraded to the point of destroying the environment. And those folks are able to come here freely and then eventually transition to maybe permanent residence and citizenship. That's a small number, but it's a nice model because it captures that idea of, we've done some harm. Here's a sort of escape valve so that people for whom migration would be a terrific adaptation strategy, it's a little bit easier. And it's not everybody. People stay, but for the people who want to come, there's that. So there are historic examples that we can build from. Um, and I think it is well past time. And I'll pivot to something positive that I think goes back to some of the questions in the Q&A about the political challenges and the viability. One of the ways that international law does move and norms shift is when we perceive a common struggle. The reason the Refugee Convention came together back in 1951 is that each country recognized at some point we may need this of each other, this little narrow exception. And the fact that climate change literally, as Professor Jaya started us off with the analogy of a home, it's our home. It's all the nations of the world are in the same home. We all have a stake in this. It's easy for us all to think about migration scenarios, whether it's people trying to leave Tempe, Arizona, because now Albany feels like Tempe, Arizona, like Professor Jaya said, or people crossing international borders. This is a problem we can relate to, and that may create space for some more radical reimagining than seems politically possible in November 2021.
Yeah, that's great. Let me ask, I think, Liz, you've kind of given your closing remarks right there. I'll ask Professor Grossman or Professor Jaya if there are other things you want to add to the discussion before I wrap it up.
Sure. So to add to my earlier point about, different strategies for climate denial and kind of increasing climate inaction. Another one of those strategies, which is really prominent now, is climate despair. So this idea that it's too far and nothing can be done. So if you are feeling that, dear audience member, whoever you might be, or panelists, know that you're falling into a trap. There are things that can be done. We have most of the technology that we need in order to achieve the goals that I had already set. It's a matter of implementation, of financing, of finance sharing, but that is known. We know how to do this, and it's simply a matter of will and economics at this point.
That is a more optimistic note. Makes me feel better. Thank you. Nikki, anything to say as we wrap up here?
I think one aspect of this that gives me some hope is the enormous amount of brain power that is going into thinking about this problem and how to address it, and seeing how NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have been stepping up to the plate and pushing this issue. We haven't mentioned this, but there are, many, or maybe we did a little bit, but there are many particularly vulnerable groups and that have been pushing to make change here, including Indigenous voices, and that they've pushed very hard because they're very impacted, right? The same goes for youth. So I'm not trying to, my point is that there are lots of really smart, dedicated people working on this project of trying to fix the world and save it from climate change. And I hope that our audience, particularly students, will be part of that group and think about ways that they too can contribute to solutions here.
That's a great charge to all of us. You said fix the world. It reminds me of a conversation that Sonia and I had earlier today, just before a faculty meeting. I said to her, sort of in jest, I said, well, how bad is it? How much time does Earth have here? And she said, Earth is going to be fine. I mean, the physical planet is going to continue to exist. It's humanity that is challenged here. I thought that was a very profound observation, and it certainly focuses one's mind and, as you say, Nikki, brain power on doing everything we can do to address this. It is a moral imperative. I think everyone here feels that, and I so appreciate the three of you bringing your expertise and experience to bear on this problem and to helping to educate all of us about the challenge of climate migration and climate change more generally. So thank you all. Thank you to our audience members for participating and for being with us. This it appears it will be our last UB Law in Focus webinar of the calendar year. But we will be back with both events like this and maybe some live events that bring our faculty expertise to bear on the issues of the day. So I wish everybody happy holidays, and let's get to work in saving humanity here. Thank you all very much.